Apologies. You've all missed everyone on the recording just missed the first 2 minutes. How horrible will that be for you later when you listen to it? Never mind. We're on housekeeping at the moment, so I'm just saying, please share on social, tweet using the hashtag I have here. Any technical issues, drop those into the chat box. Q&A I've already mentioned. Please drop those into the panel if you have any questions and we'll pick those up. The recording, now that we are starting to record, will be available on the Red Group website from tomorrow. And I'm assured that there will also be a quick survey at some point during the webinar. So please answer that when you can. Otherwise, we'll send that out with the emails that go out tomorrow with the link to the webinar itself. So please get involved, make this interactive. I'm sure Ian and Tim and I would all value that rather than us sitting chatting on our own, which we're happy to do, incidentally, but that's probably not the best thing to do. Just before we get going, I wanted to just give you a quick overview in terms of Red Group and who we are. So the Red Group are the UK's most trusted data and insight agency. We help brands, whether that's charities or brands in other sectors, to get to know their data in a lot more detail and then to use that data effectively, whether that's keeping the data up to date and clean, finding new people to acquire through different channels such as social, digital, direct mail, email, etc. Carrying out insight projects and understanding customers in more detail, or building tech solutions to help you to get best value from your data. We do all of that stuff and more, anything data related really we get involved with. Our sort of key principle is that the more you know about an individual, then the better your marketing will be. And you know, when we talk about knowing stuff about individuals, that's also about what is going to make them respond to campaigns and what's going to make them interested in your message and your ask. And that's the kind of stuff that we're going to concentrate on today, obviously. Anyway, enough of the advertising about Red Group. Let's move on with what we're here for, which is to talk about meaningful market measurement. And really this came about, as I said, with conversations with Tim. And what we wanted to look at was what made charities successful in terms of the campaigns that they ran. How do they measure the success of those campaigns, and what can we learn from that? So we commissioned the DMA to take a look into their big, vast database, which we'll talk about in more detail, no doubt, to see what they could find. And the outcome was a white paper that we pulled together between DMA, Ian, and Red Group that basically shows what is happening and what is successful within the charity campaigns that we could look at. So what I'm going to do now is just hand over to Ian, and Ian will present the findings of the research. And then at the end of that, we'll pick up in terms of any Q&A that anyone has. Thank you very much, Ian.
Great, thank you, Scott, and good to see you all today. So look, I'm going to just do a little bit of context, scene setting before we get into the data and the insight itself. I have an obligatory slide on the effect of the cost of living crisis on charities. I'm afraid this is going to be a very overused slide over the next couple of years, unfortunately. But yeah, this report from Third Sector saying that the number of UK people donating to charities fell by over 2 million amidst the cost of living crisis. Of course, you know, it has been a challenging couple of years for charities. You know, at the start of the pandemic, on-street donations dried up. Charity store revenue obviously dried up. Everyone had to do what they could to elicit more response out of donors in difficult times. And of course, you know, no sooner did we get to grips with that than we come out of the pandemic, or in the latter pandemic stages, I should say. And, you know, we're suddenly looking at this cost of living crisis. So, you know, it's certainly been a challenging time. And I suppose we had to ask ourselves what the role of marketing has been in eliciting response from donors in these challenging times. And there are obviously lots of different strategic and tactical levers that we can pull to do so. You know, I guess the decisions that people have been making are between, you know, do I go all in on short-term direct response, doing everything I can just to drive donations? Do I focus a little bit more on long-term brand building, you know, communicating the values and the purpose of our brand, our charitable brand to consumers? Do I focus on retention, you know, looking at existing donors? Do I try and acquire new donors? I mean, the Marketoon has kind of summed up the approach of many organizations in the early pandemic phase with this cartoon. I think we can all identify with this. Some brand we apparently gave an email address to 3 or 4 years ago wants us to know they're here for us in this difficult time. And, you know, I think actually, you know, given that charities are essentially purpose-driven organizations, I think they would have had permission to speak to their donors and the people in their database in this way. Perhaps your average kind of like double glazing firm that you hadn't spoken to for 10 years might not have had the same sort of permission. But yeah, it's just kind of like, it shows the sorts of challenges that people have had and the sort of tactical and strategic decisions they've had to make in how they sort of focus their marketing over the last couple of years. And at the same time, sort of underpinning all of this is just this overriding question, which isn't, is not just for this sector, but for all sectors. Just this question around whether marketing effectiveness is actually improving or not. I mean, if you were to look at the IPA's own effectiveness data bank, they've been talking about a crisis in creative effectiveness for years now. The respective sort of creative data person, Orlando Wood, talking about it here in the WFA. But if you look at other data sources, if you look at the respected econometrician, Grace Kite, she says the marketing crisis is over and actually ROI has been improving year on year. But as we'll talk about in a second, ROI is only one measure of marketing effectiveness. So it's kind of hard to unpick the truth, what really is happening out there. And how can we apply this to our the charitable sector? So we're looking to the DMA's Intelligent Marketing Data Bank for answers to some of these questions. How effective is charity marketing? How has that evolved over the last few years? And what are the key drivers of campaign success? If you're wondering what the Intelligent Marketing Data Bank is, it has been around for a couple of years now. It's an effectiveness data bank that is built on the back of over 1,000 DMA award campaigns. So I've read over 1,000 DMA award entries over the last couple of years, which has been a labour of love, sometimes sent me slightly insane, but it's been a very valuable exercise. The great thing about the data bank, what I quite like, is that it's got a nice blend of like direct response, short-term driving, sort of response driving campaigns, and sort of longer term brand building activity in there, activity which is looking to change how we think and feel about brands. About half the campaigns have a pure response focus, a quarter have a pure brand focus, and a quarter have like a dual response and brand objective. So there's a nice blend of the two in there, which allows us to look at the differences between both kind of strategies. We've got half a year's worth of data in there as well. And 138 of those campaigns are charity sector campaigns. So we will be looking at some overall trends, but as much as humanly possible, we'll be focusing on that charity data as we go through this presentation. Now, in terms of how we actually sort of measure effectiveness, our metric of effectiveness basically involves going through these entries, looking at the results section and quantifying the number of effects that people are talking about in their entries that they're attributing to different campaigns. Now, there are a whopping 170 different ways which people talk about effectiveness, which frankly, if you're in the measurement space, is a bit of a lookout. It's having hard to have a joined up conversation about effectiveness if you're using 170 different measures, but that's perhaps a conversation for another day. We then bucket those 170 different measures into 4 distinct groups. Now, one of the groups of metrics we refer to as business effects. Now, outside of the world of sort of not-for-profit, we'll be talking about the sort of effects that ensure the long-term survival of a brand: profit, market share growth, penetration, customer loyalty, price sensitivity. Obviously, for charities, a lot of this will revolve around, well, I guess, the profits generated by marketing, but also like loyalty will be important. But overridingly, I guess the business effect, business inverted commas, it's really important for charities, is whether they are, I suppose, fulfilling their long-term purpose, whether they are influencing policy change or changing or having an impact on society. So that's the kind of a business effect equivalent for charities, that long-term sort of goal, as it were, where that's being achieved. You then got brand effects, which are just as relevant for charities as everyone else. Are we raising awareness of our organization? People's consideration to donate, their perceptions of the brand. Purchase intent would obviously be donation intent, but those are our brand effects. And I guess, brand building isn't necessarily about driving immediate response. It's more about generating future response. Next time that someone is thinking of donating and they're sort of thinking about where they might want to donate, if you've done a good brand building job, hopefully you come top of mind. Response effects. So obviously the charity space is about driving immediate donations, but if you think about the mechanism by which we might want to do that, we might want people to get involved in competitions and all that sort of competitions and different sorts of activities with which to drive response. But it's all about driving that short-term donation. Fourth bucket, campaign delivery effects. These are things like the reach of the campaign, the frequency with which people saw it, the impressions delivered. We also include digital vanity metrics like clicks, likes, and shares. What you're probably all thinking is these aren't effects at all. And you're absolutely right, they're not, but we've put them in there because that's how people talk about effectiveness in our award entries. Really, brand effects sit at the top of the sort of donation funnel or customer journey. Response effects sit at the sharp end. Business effects are kind of a halo effect all around it, and campaign delivery effects are really just inputs into this process. They're not outputs, they're inputs. So what we've done for the rest of this presentation, we've just focused on a metric that looks at the average number of brand, response, and business effects generated. We've discounted those less meaningful campaign delivery effects because they don't really, someone says how effective is your campaign, you say it reached 10 million people. That's great, but kind of so what? We want to know how much they donated and their loyalty and that kind of thing. So yeah, so for the rest of the presentation, we're focusing on brand, response, and business effects. So what does this metric look like when we try and answer this question, how effective charity marketing is? So here you have got our all campaign average across all 1,000 campaigns in dark blue and charity campaign average in green. Look at the right-hand side of this screen. The average campaign generates 2.7 effects across business, brand, and response. Charity campaigns are a little bit more successful than the average campaign. They generate 2.9 effects on average. Cast your eye to the left-hand side of the screen, and it's apparent where this success comes from. They're very good charity marketers at driving response, driving immediate donation. Slightly less good than average at building brands. As you can see, 0.3 brand effects versus 0.5 on average, and about equal at driving business effects. So yeah, very good response drivers. That's where that success is coming from. If we actually want to look at the sector rankings, charities are actually, well, I mean, they're fourth equal with automotive in terms of how effective they are campaign wise, just behind financial services, retail, and utilities. So charity marketeers, give yourself a pat on the back. You're doing a pretty good job compared to some of the other sectors at driving response in difficult times. It's when we start to split out these effects between brand, business, and response that we get a sense again of where charity marketing tends to find its strengths. So as you can see here, I've highlighted that charity campaigns drive those 2.2 response effects per campaign. If you're just to rank these sectors based on response effects, I mean, charity would be number 2, second only to retail in driving response from campaigns. Very effective short-term response drivers. If you were to rank it on brand effects, though, in green, you know, it would appear much further down the ranking, generally not as adept as the other sectors at building brands. And, you know, that might be working in the short term, but we need to probably have a think about and have a discussion about what that means in the long run. If we have a look at the evolution of effectiveness over the last 5 years, so look at the all campaign average to begin with. Sorry, jumped on it. That jumped ahead there. Look at the all campaign average in dark blue. As you can see, in 2020, the early pandemic phase, there was a boost in campaign effectiveness, even though there was that kind of mini ad recession in that kind of spring 2020, which we've bounced back from now, thankfully. You know, there was an increase in effectiveness. People sort of did more with less. They were more capable of driving effectiveness from smaller budgets. That's tailed off though in the latter in the latter pandemic phase in 2021. We have actually seen effectiveness decline throughout most of these years. Charities have been above average. In fact, charity campaign effectiveness peaked in 2019. It did decline slightly in 2020, but it's still above average. But in 2021, I have to say, you know, like the other campaigns in the data bank, charity campaign effectiveness has really dropped off. In that late pandemic phase, we are finding it harder and harder to elicit response. And I think, you know, we are obviously seeing this cost of living crisis growing. We have seen the early stages of that in 2021. I think, you know, the charity sector has not been immune to that. There has certainly been a tail off in effectiveness. And here you can see why. I mean, look at the purple bar at the bottom. This is a number of brand effects driven. Actually, you know, in the pandemic phase, charity campaigns got a little bit better at building brands, even though they're kind of worse than average at doing so, but they have got a little bit better at building brands. But their effectiveness at driving response has absolutely sort of plummeted. And I think, perhaps they were really good at sweating their budgets and driving response from people in the early pandemic phase. People were stuck at home. They were feeling generous. They had less to spend their money on, more competition for that kind of share of wallet in 2021. I think we've really seen that effect as response has dipped in that phase. When we look at the drivers of effectiveness, there's a few that we're going to look at here. We can look at the length of campaign. So look at the chart on the left-hand side of the screen to begin with. When we talk about short-term campaigns, we're talking about campaigns which are 1 to 3 months in duration. Medium-term campaigns are 4 to 12 months. And long-term campaigns are over a year in duration. Now, actually, charity sector is slightly more likely to run a short-term campaign than the average campaign, 54% are short-term. And I think it probably slightly more likely because, of course, they have to be quite responsive to world events. A lot of it's, campaign and event based. So I guess it makes sense that they are often, operating in slightly shorter bursts as they look to achieve specific goals. We have looked on the right-hand side of the screen. We've just looked at charity campaigns pre-pandemic and then sort of in the pandemic. Actually, the kind of blend of short-term versus long-term hasn't really changed. For all the other sectors, we saw a real drive to short-term during the pandemic. But I think because charity campaigns were already quite short-term in focus, we didn't necessarily see that shift. They stayed kind of with a similar blend of short-term versus long-term. The reason we care about short-term versus long-term is this. Look at the dark blue. Oh, look at the dark blue line to begin with. Let me just click on. Look at the dark blue line to begin with. Generally, so for the average campaign, it is true that the longer the campaign, the more chance it has to accumulate more effects. The longer term the campaign, the more effective it is. This is actually, and it's certainly true that charity campaigns generate more effects when they're over 12 months on average. But where charity campaigns are quite unique is they're very good at driving lots of effects in the short term, in that 1 to 3 month time period, even more so than they are in that 4 to 12 month time period. And again, I think it's just because charities have to be quite responsive, or well, often some charities have to be quite responsive to specific world events. They have specific campaigns which relate to specific causes, specific appeals, and so they're quite adept at driving that response in a short-term time frame, more so than other sectors. We can have a look on the left-hand side of the screen again. Let's look at the proportion of campaigns which are targeted at driving an immediate response versus, so that's in green, versus just having a brand objective like raising awareness, or in dark blue is whether the campaign has a dual brand and response objective. As you can see, charity versus average, charity campaigns are a bit more likely to have a response objective. It's called this is all adding into the same pitch that we've been talking about now, slightly less likely to have a brand objective. Look at the right-hand side of this screen, though, and this really changed during the pandemic. The proportion of charity campaigns with a pure response objective, it really contracted by about 20 percentage points. The proportion having a brand objective went up, and actually the proportion of campaigns trying to do both things, response and brand, doubled from 14% to 28%. So yeah, I think there's probably a sense that, in slightly difficult times, just hitting people with a donate now message might not be the most appropriate thing to do. Having some sort of brand driven message, which was a little bit more purpose driven and really try to, appeal to people's hearts and minds a little bit more and trigger some sort of emotional response, that was deemed to be the way to go. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at the next slide, campaigns which have a brand and response objective on the right-hand side tend to be more effective than those which have a pure response or pure brand objective. So you may sort of ask, well, why has charity campaign effectiveness declined if they're doing more of the sort of thing that works well, having a sort of combined brand and response objective? I think the answer is, well, look, all effectiveness declined in the early pandemic phase. Don't forget that charities managed to stay ahead of the average campaign in 2020. And this is probably the reason why, because they were doing the right sort of thing, focusing on brand and response. However, despite their best efforts in 2021, we just have seen this decline in effectiveness. There is only so much response you can sort of sweat out of, donors in difficult circumstances. And the kind of sort of final piece of this sort of, campaign strategy jigsaw Let's have a look at whether campaigns have an acquisition objective, going after new donors, retention objectives, speaking to existing donors, or trying to do a bit of both. You can see here on the left-hand side of the screen, charities are much more likely to have an acquisition objective than they are a retention objective. And they're also more likely to try and do both. And this actually, again, really changed across the pandemic. What changed? So the proportion having a sort of acquisition objective kind of stayed pretty stable, 63% to 60%. The proportion having a pure retention objective really contracted. Charities were again trying to do both things at once, you know, speak to existing donors and acquire new ones. There's this kind of, we're building up a picture here of charities trying to do a lot with their creative, have a brand effect, have a response effect, speak to current donors, speak to new donors. So there's a little bit of sort of trying to have your cake and eat it. Generally, this stuff, it can work having you doing both things at once. I don't know, but perhaps there is a sense that if you're trying to do everything at once, perhaps you do lose a bit of focus. So those are some of the drivers. The final section before we perhaps get onto the Q&A, we're going to talk about the impact of channel selection and charity campaign effectiveness. The great thing about the data bank is it's got lots of above the line channels, lots of below the line channels, lots of channels which are good at driving response, lots of channels are good at driving brand effects. I think everyone talks about the strength of multi-channel, and now here in the dark blue line, we can see the proportion of campaigns that are multi-channel for the average campaign. So what this tells us is about 45% of campaigns are just single channel in the database. About 30% have 2 channels, about 10% have 3 channels, so on and so forth. Where the green line crosses the blue line, this indicates that charity campaigns are more likely to be multi-channel than the average campaign. Charity marketeers are more adept at picking and choosing a broader range of channels to achieve their goals. And if we look for that multi-channel sweet spot, well, what we can see is it tends to be at the 3+ channels stage. So look, in the blue, these are charity campaigns running across just 1 or 2 channels. In the green, these are charity campaigns running across 3 or more channels. And as you can see, there is, you know, a distinct uplift for those campaigns running across 3 or more channels. Not just at response, where we know charity campaigns are good, not just at business effects, but also at brand effects. So, you know, I think we've seen that charity campaigns are a little perform below average at driving brand effects, but that's not to say they can't do it. You know, and if you do want to think about driving brand, do think about a multi-channel strategy. You know, I guess shifting the dial on brand metrics like awareness and perceptions, it's all about picking and choosing different media channels which can be targeted by time of day while people are in different mood states, in different contexts. You know, what can you do with out of home versus TV? The different need states which will help influence how people think and feel and respond to those ads. And that's definitely why brand building works well with a multi-channel campaign. We can also have a look at the channels that are most effective at driving response effects for charity campaigns. And so at the top, we consider this ad mail. So ad mail here is a combination of direct mail and door drops, anything that comes to a letterbox basically, but charity campaigns, which include an ad mail element, tend to drive 3 response effects on average. And then you've got TV and digital display. Everything else then, you know, I'm not saying that they're poor performers, but everything else is sort of slightly sort of coalesces together. You know, similar levels of performance across email, social, radio, and that sort of thing. Out of home at the bottom, not particularly seen as a good response driver for charities. When it comes to building brand effects, though, slightly different picture. Actually, when it comes to brand building, so stimulating that sort of future activity, so really trying to change how people think and feel about charity brands, actually radio is a pretty good driver of it. And at the same time, press and mags and TV, all driving, you know, half a brand effect on average. And then, you know, these are kind of these classic above the line brand building channels. I guess they all do different things at different time of day. Radio is often, you know, famed for working well on the commutes to and from work. Press and mags, you know, that kind of tactile nature of the ad, lean forward, high engagement, and of course TV, which we all know and has been proven time again to be a great ROI driver and brand builder. given the creativity of what you can do with the medium. So interesting to see slightly different channels coming to the fore if you're having a brand objective. What we've done on the next slide is we've just, on the vertical axis, we've just looked at the average number of brand effects driven by campaign per channel, and the horizontal axis, number of response effects. So in the bottom right, you've got strong response driving channels. So you've got ad mail in there, and to a lesser extent towards the left, you've got email as well. So if you're all about driving response, you've got to think about these channels. Top left, good brand building channels. You've got digital display, press and mags. But the top right, if you kind of want to have your cake and eat it and do a little bit of both, then you've really got to be thinking about TV and digital display. That's where you're going to get a nice combined effect, and to a slightly lesser extent, radio and audio and social as well. So certainly different considerations depending on what you're trying to achieve with your campaign. So look, I think that's probably enough for me. So look, in summary, I would just say, look, charity campaigns, we've seen they're above average performers. They do generate more effects than the average campaign. Typically, it's driven by their ability to drive more immediate direct response effects, like rather than build brand effects where they tend to underperform. That said, we have seen, a bit of a movement of charities trying to focus a little bit more on brand building during the pandemic. But I think, probably more concerted effort is needed in this space if we're to see them become above average performers in terms of brand building. Campaign effectiveness has been declining over time, unfortunately. Charity campaigns did hold their head above average in terms of early pandemic phase, late pandemic phase. Just like any other sector, though, effectiveness has declined. It's getting harder and harder to drive response from cash-strapped consumers. If we are really thinking about what we need to do to drive response, though, a multi-channel approach matters. 3+ channels is recommended. And as we've just seen, if you've got a response campaign, think about your channels. It might be more about ad mail and email. If it's about a combination of brand and response, think about radio and TV and digital display, because they're also going to have a significant effect here. It's all about what you're trying to achieve. So that's it from me. I think perhaps we will now open this up to a bit of Q&A and a discussion between myself, Tim, and Scott. Thanks very much. Right, I think we just need you guys to unmute yourself.
Yep, sorry, I couldn't find
no worries.
Apologies. I'm going to take off share as well, actually.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah, we don't need sharing anymore. How's that?
That's fine.
Good, thank you. So welcome Tim in as well. Hi Tim, how are you today?
Very good, thank you, Scott.
Good, good. We've had a few questions actually, so I'll come to those in a minute. But before we do, I wanted to ask a couple of questions of you guys before we get going. So first of all, Tim, one of the questions I had right at the beginning when we started looking at this was about the data itself and how representative you think award entries are of the whole sector. Because a fear within all of this would be, do we have some bias here because people put in their best work, as it were, into campaigns, into awards?
Yeah, definitely. It's a question we get about the data bank almost every time we talk about it, isn't it, Ian? I think yes, there is. That's a natural part of where we get the data from. It's also a natural issue that almost all of the banks like this come up against, right? Because more often than not, these case studies are developed for the best work or for the work that has been successful and has achieved its aims. So there is always going to be that natural bias. I think that's why we're very careful when we talk about the data, that we're not talking about, the individual ROIs, for example. We take these proxies of how many effects they've had, and we use that to try to understand relative to each other year how they're performing. So yes, we are probably looking at the top end of the work, but that's why we're not saying the ROI is X. We're saying, well, actually, compared to last year, this top end has gone up or down relatively. The other thing to say is, there is precedent for the way that we've built this. Ian mentioned the IPA's own effectiveness data bank uses a very similar one, very similar process, and that same proxy as well. There are a couple around that are starting to bring in, I know because me and Ian were just talking about one a couple of weeks ago, that bring in both the good and bad. The challenge there is just access. With the best will in the world, even I'm probably not going to get many brands or agencies to give me the work that didn't work.
Yeah,
I would also add as well, when you're looking at the data, what you really want as like a sort of data person is just like a good spread of results, you know, so you can start to say, what does good look like, what does bad. If all the entries had exactly the same kind of level of results, then that wouldn't be very meaningful. But there is a good spread in there, which is useful for us for looking at key drivers.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the volume, I can't see many other places where you would get 1,000+ campaigns to do comparison on, or even 138 charity campaigns to do comparison on. So the actual, the strength is in the depth, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And that's also one of the things we when we set this up, we talked about a lot, was also one of the unique things about the DMA and the audience and the people who enter the DMAs is that spread and breadth that we're looking at, even just in the measures we see behind it. We've got proper top end brand measures right the way down to, individual interactions, because we've got campaigns that are kind of traditionally above the line and below the line, and that blur between the two, because that line is getting softer and softer and grayer as the years go by.
Yeah, interesting. So a question for you then, Ian, just to get ourselves warmed up. And there's a lot in your presentation which was really interesting about the effect of the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic and how the nature of the campaigns themselves changed over that time period. So focus on acquisition, less effects, so sort of more focus on show me the money, I guess, was quite a lot of that. Do you think the pandemic was a good thing or a bad thing when we specifically just look at campaigns for charities? Because there's a lot going on there, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we can certainly say from the early pandemic phase, when we saw effectiveness across the entire database increase, I know for charities it dipped slightly, but it was still ahead of the average. I think you could argue that was a good thing for marketing, because it just forced people to do more with less. And it's like, well, you've managed to elicit more response from slightly lower budgets, then you're clearly, I don't know, you've clearly got more efficient in the way in which you are doing something, in which you're planning. But then I suppose on the downside, if that early effectiveness was driven at the expense of long-term thinking, I do think that's a challenge. Because I think, if you haven't gone all in on response, then of course you could, if you transition all of your budget to something very response focused, of course you're going to see an immediate boost in results. Yeah. What does that mean in the long run, though? There is a reason people invest in brand building, for salience and to stimulate future demand and to stay top of mind. If you're not investing in this sort of stuff, will you be around in 5 to 10 years? Hard to say. I mean, hard to predict now, but I guess the historical evidence would suggest not.
Yeah, and I guess that's it's a key point about ignoring the pandemic for a bit. Just the charity campaigns compared to the other sectors is the focus on response, and I guess that's probably driven by the trustees and the charities themselves. The focus on getting the money in the door now, to the detriment potentially of longer term brand building.
Yeah, exactly. And I know there is a reason that charities invest in raffles and prize draws. They're fantastic response drivers. But if that's all you're ever going to do, I'm not suggesting for people that's all they ever do, but if that's all you're ever going to do, you do have to wonder what the long-term impact on your brand is going to be. These are purpose-driven organizations. At some point, we have to communicate that purpose to people.
Yeah, and we've got an interesting comment on the Q&A about that, actually. So someone said, a really interesting presentation. Thank you. I couldn't ignore that, so I'll mention that. As a brand marketer, I still encounter challenges from leadership and trustees about the value of investing in brand marketing. So the presentation is really useful in demonstrating that. It's really frustrating that charities still seem to be behind in understanding the importance of investing in brand to underpin future response and focused on that short-term response and short-term gain effectively. And that's what you've illustrated very well, I guess, in what we see here. Yeah.
And interesting, they have tried to do a bit more of it during the pandemic, but we are still behind the curve as a sector. So I think these difficult conversations that are happening in the boardroom just need to be played out. We need to be arming marketeers with the evidence to have these kind of like high level and slightly difficult discussions in the boardroom. But that's where reporting on true campaign effectiveness, I think, is key. That's why we can't go into the boardroom and someone says, how'd your campaign deliver? And you say, it reached 10 million people. I mean, that's going to frustrate a board member. We need to talk about these things in real numbers. If you've seen a 15% in awareness, what that means is, for every 100 people reach the campaign, an additional 15 people are now able to recall your brand. Let's start quantifying these brand metrics and things that are meaningful for the board. I think that would probably help.
Yeah, thank you. So another question on our Q&A, one for you maybe, Tim, to pick up first. It's about the level of detail, I guess, to a certain extent. So the question is about whether we have any data about the effectiveness of different types of social media channels. Are any social media channels themselves particularly good for different types of effectiveness? I guess that's about trying to get under the skin of some of the data in a bit more detail, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we don't have any specifics on the individual sort of social platforms or networks, because there's not enough to really be able to pull out, what's good for what. We do have some insights around email, which actually we released a couple of months ago, and I know later in the year we'll be doing a piece around mail specifically. But one of the things that came out of the email analysis and comes out over and over again is actually this idea of multi-channel, and that actually there is a benefit to these working in synergy, almost to that point around brand and response, that actually if you're keying on response on a single channel, you are truly reliant on that one thing reaching the right person at the right time and triggering them to do something in that convenient thing. Whereas if you are putting the messages out in that awareness, it could actually be that your brand campaign over here, sorry, I'm not sure if you can see my hands waving around, but your brand campaign could actually be the thing that triggers them to go, oh, actually, I was going to donate there. But it was your response that triggered them to know that they could, if you see what I mean. But those things don't necessarily have to be at the same point, which comes to a whole conversation about attribution and tracking effectiveness, which is a different topic for a different day, and could take us a week.
But I guess there's a couple of things in the question as well, Ian, isn't there? The social itself actually came out quite strongly in terms of a good channel for both brand and response. Not as strong as TV or radio, but still pretty strong overall.
Yeah. And that's not necessarily true for all sectors. I think if you look in the main report, not just the charity specific one for this, it looks like social probably gets a little bit more credit that it deserves in the brand building space generally, but for charities, it does seem to have an effect. And I just wonder, hard to unpick why. I think, you'd probably need to look at some case studies to try and understand why that is. But I'd
wonder if there's more natural sharing because of the nature of it, because the nature of those campaigns would be more purposeful and may well have more organic kind of performance than maybe any regular brand would necessarily be able to achieve. So I think that's one thing, that if you are going to use social and you're looking for effectiveness, is try to get, if they're not going to give to you in that action, what can you do to spark them to share in the right way, which when you come to social sharing is a whole other kind of challenge, and not sparking the wrong kinds of conversations.
Of course, that's it, isn't it? And I think you're absolutely right, Tim. People are more likely to share something purpose-driven. I mean, it's a horrible term, which I hate, because it's used by the wrong people, misused, but the whole virtue signaling thing you could suggest is a little bit part of it. And I guess also there's just this element of, I'm thinking back to some of the entries, there's a lot of organic social reported on as well. Of course, if your budgets are limited, well, you're going to go all in and as organically as you can.
Also, there's some of the campaigns that certainly come to mind. They are the kinds of content or stories that you without even having seen it on social, you may then actually want to share it with somebody, or share this amazing piece. I'm thinking of some of the really fun ones from years gone by, like the pause with mind boxes, where you get this lovely sort of box. It's a tangible thing that once you subscribe, they might be getting kind of social benefit from that without ever really asking or pushing for it. The other really lovely one was, I always forget the name of the monsters, and we talked about them just the other day.
Moshi, Mask Monsters, was it?
Oh, it was Scope's Mindful Monsters.
Mindful Monsters.
I had it open on my browser, so I had a quick look. No, it was the Mindful Monsters from Scope, which, if you haven't seen them, go and look. They're I'm not sure if the campaign's still running because it's a few years old now, but they were just these beautiful artwork, really fun, and there were I remember seeing in that award entry some of the social stuff that was shared, because it was influencers but doing it off their own back. I don't think there was much kind of support in there, and just people who were showing these things to their kids and sharing the stories about actually them taking a more mindful attitude to or sorry, incorporating that mindfulness into their life, which again has that natural kind of action with it as well, and can create that bit more of community.
And that sort of value exchange versus simply asking for, you know, like a direct response is a really interesting topic, isn't it? It's not, I guess it's not something the charity sector necessarily would think of most of the time, you know, in terms of, you know, well, maybe that's not true, because you did have very successful campaigns like the Dogs Trust sponsor a puppy and sponsor a donkey and such like from other charities. So that is a value exchange in that sense, isn't it? And
I think there's some really unique charity challenges there are around that. Not just the kind of the repeat supporter, and how you keep them engaged and understanding that value beyond that they are doing a good thing, right? That they're supporting a good cause. Actually, where can we start to build in some of those processes? So I mentioned the paused box from Mind, which is one that always stuck with me, because I after I saw the award entry, I've gifted it to like multiple family members and friends since variously. But that's sort of one instance where it's not the kind of adopter style, which there are a couple around the animal space. That's the one that kind of stands out as something a bit different. There's also a unique challenge because there's almost this immediacy versus long term, even when you're looking for that kind of action, where I see in charity, which you can't really see in any other sector. I know we were talking about this the other day, and I still can't think of one even now, where you've got the kind of immediate donation, whether it's, I don't know, 10p in a bucket or a donation of however many pounds to support a particular cause or a particular push, right the way through to, you know, asking for legacies. And that really, you know, those massive kind of decisions and potential amounts of money. What other sector is dealing with that scale and difference and everything in between in terms of the asks they're making? So even in those response or more response-driven campaigns, you know, what the response you're asking for is so fundamentally different. And I don't think you're ever going to get that top one without being a trusted brand and potentially having some of that brand campaign to really underpin it and show that you're a charity worthy of that kind of legacy donation as well.
Indeed, interesting. So actually there's another question here which kind of ties into what you're just talking about. So the question is, how can charities create effective donation-driven individual giving campaigns when the target audience is mainly composed of low-income families who can't afford to donate? So I guess that's playing into one thing about audience and understanding audience, and I think just to go back to your point you just made, Tim, it's not all low-income families. There might be, you know, there might be a big proportion compared to other sectors, but there are still people that give to charities who are very wealthy, particularly on that legacy end, I guess. But still, the question remains around the fact that we are entering into quite a tough period for a lot of people. What should charities be doing? And does that come back to the brand building answer again?
Yeah, there's probably a bit of that, but then it's also, you know, it's funny because we also think, you know, charities, because they're kind of technically not for profit, they're different to other commercial organizations, but they're not. I think the principles of how we the marketing principles should be the same as any other organization, more commercially driven organization, as should, I guess, our sort of defining principles about how we go about running our business. And this idea of, like, I suppose, what do we do with low income families? I suppose, you know, is it about just going for mass reach and just encourage, rather than just keep targeting our existing donors who we know respond, but there's only so much additional response we can sweat out of them? Should we just go for, like, you know, people talk about micro payments, should we go for micro donations across a much broader base? Perhaps that's how we should be aiming. I mean, you know, obviously the kind of world of marketing theory that people love talking about, Byron Sharp, how brands grow, and he's like a big sort of believer in sort of saying, well, look, don't don't just go after your existing customers. You got to go after like acquisition targets. He always uses the example of like Coca-Cola. Someone's drinking 2 cans of Coke a day. It's very hard to get them to drink a third Coke. It's much easier to get someone who drinks like, I don't know, a Fanta or a Pepsi to switch to Coke. Where am I going with this analogy? I think the point is what I'm saying is it's probably just easier to get someone who doesn't donate to you at all to donate a very small amount than it is to keep sweating more and more response out of your most loyal donors. That would be a theory. I'm not a charity marketer myself, but perhaps something you have to consider in difficult economic times.
And maybe that's why most of the marketing moved to acquisition away from retention at that time.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think also about the last couple of years and then going into here, there was some data released just last week from the Charities Aid Foundation Forum, CAF. Foundation, sorry, around the losses. So they reckon, nearly 5 million people since 2019, 5 million less people are donating. So, it could well be that success we saw in the pandemic was actually an increase of support where people could, and the people who, had come out during the pandemic and out of the pandemic had come out quite financially strong, but now, everyone's belts are tightening. So we're potentially moving back down into more challenging times. So I think to the question about the lower income, it is just going to get harder. So trying to tap into new audiences might be a solution. That same data thought, I think it was about 500 million less just year on year they're expecting to be donated this year, and that's that's a significant amount of money. So not to be doom and gloom, but I think we are entering a time where people are going to have to make those difficult decisions about, whether they're getting their meal, where they're getting their meals from, let alone, how they're supporting charities.
Just go back to, sorry, on you go.
Yeah, so I was going to say, and this is where brand building is important, because recession's not going to be, we're not going to be in recession forever. So if we can't stimulate immediate demand, then do we think about brand building so that when people are coming out of these difficult circumstances, we're top of mind? I'm always conscious of that, that piece of advice, which is, those who advertise through a recession come out on top. And it's easy for me to say when I'm not a budget holder, but perhaps that's more important than ever, when it comes to the charity sector. If it's hard to elicit donations, let's think about how we can create meaningful future relationships with audiences instead.
So an interesting question here about the change in law, the change in rules around opt-ins and soft opt-ins. So just pick up on some of your email points from earlier, Tim. It's something that we've lobbied for, isn't it, to allow charities to have soft opt-ins. But do you think that's likely to also have a detrimental effect potentially of people, as you move into difficult times, sort of over sweating email and over mailing people and, trying to milk that channel more? Email's been quite responsive over the last few years because email data has been hard to get, if you like.
Yeah, I'm on the first part of that. I did see that question. On the first part of it, I'm going to aggressively sidestep answering it because anything to do with that, we've got the lovely John Mitchison at the DMA, who's our Director of Policy and Compliance, and Asley, who's our head of legal. They would be more than happy to answer all of your questions about where we are, where we might be, and where we're going when it comes to soft opt-in. I do not answer compliance questions, I'm afraid. But on the second part, I completely agree. There is concern, I think, about how you use it. I think one of the good things that has happened over the last few years is, certainly from some of the email professionals I speak to, there has become wider understanding outside of just the sort of email and marketing professionals who kind of use email a lot, that over sweating, to use the phrase that we use, but over messaging some of those audiences just doesn't work. Yeah. You turn them off, you lose them permanently, and there's no benefit. And that actually, even before that, if you get into the technicalities, you're going to impact your deliverability, which is going to ultimately mean that you get less messages to the people who do want to hear from you, because they're not going to, because the inboxes aren't, the ISPs aren't going to let your emails in. So again, for email best practice, we have a whole bunch of insight from our email council, including our guides and things. So if you want more information on that, I'm sure we can direct you to it on the DMA site, or if you ask a question, I'm sure we can point you in that direction. But I think there is some concern. But I am reassured by some of the things that have happened in recent years that a generally more sensible approach is taken.
Yeah, and I think just to pick up on some of the stuff from Ian's presentation about multi-channel, email is a really excellent tool within that multi-channel environment. You know, we definitely see email combined with other channels, whether that's social, with even mail and door drops, works really effectively. So you don't need to over sweat it in any way whatsoever. You just need to be planned and sensible about where to use it, and use it as an additive. It's a cheap channel, but that doesn't mean that you need to milk it. If you use it cleverly, then it can be very effective.
Well, even in terms of measuring it, so we've been running the consumer email tracker for a number of years, and the last edition we did was 2021. So in the midst of still pandemic times, and the long-term trend hadn't changed, which is when a consumer gets an email with something they want to buy, that's the question we ask, something that you want to buy or do, 1 in 4 click on the link.
Yeah.
1 in 4 click on the link. When they want to take action, 1 in 4. That means the other 3/4 of those actions are not direct clicks. They're going to websites, they're going to price comparison sites, they're going to a marketplace if they're going to buy something, going in store, phoning the company, because some people still like phoning people. There's this whole host of other possible things. So even if you're measuring the success of your email campaign on clicks alone, you still might be missing 3/4 of the sales or interactions that are happening off the back of it.
Astonishing, really. Yeah. So talking of measurement, there's a question here that came in quite early, actually. Is lifetime value a useful KPI within the charity sector? And if so, how do charities go about calculating that? So I'll answer the first half quickly. Yes. Lifetime value is used by a lot of charities, particularly for measuring acquisition type campaigns where immediate return on the investment can be seen, but actually it's the long-term benefit and impact across time of those donors who are recruited that are really important. In terms of how you go about calculating it, there's lots of different ways you can calculate lifetime value, obviously, but we work with a number of charities who very simply just take 3-year donation value as a metric for lifetime value, and that adds a lot into the overall campaign measurement in terms of whether campaigns work or not. I don't know if you guys have got anything you want to add to that, but it's just
I can't add anything to that, Bree.
It's been sitting there, and I felt bad that I hadn't answered the question, so I thought we should do it. And there is another one actually, which is, I think, probably our final question. This is probably one for you actually, Ian. So it's about the point about campaigns representing the best of the best, which we talked about right in the beginning. I see lots of charities trying to combine business effects, usually brand and response, and failing due to creative, poor onward journeys, poor planning, etc. What do you think are the secrets to nailing a successful campaign that delivers against combined business effects?
It's funny. It's like Donna's a plant in the crowd, because I literally posted something on this in LinkedIn on Friday. So if you connect with me on LinkedIn, look at my feed. I chucked up a chart up there, which we didn't include in the main report. So Mark Ritson wrote an article in Marketing Week a few weeks ago saying it's very hard to do both things at the same time, the same execution. I think that is really hard. Buy one, get one free, and then claim you're a premium brand. Hard to do in the same execution. I think where you can achieve both is with multi-channel, because you get to assign different tasks to different channels, and that's the bit of insight that I shared on LinkedIn the other day. Basically, multi-channel campaigns are far more likely than single-channel campaigns to have a dual brand and response objective, and dual brand response objective multi-channel campaigns are a lot more effective than single channel sort of dual objective campaigns. I think if you try and do both with the same creative, very hard. If you try and do both the same channel, I think it's quite hard, because you get overlap with the audiences who are going to get exposed to it. Hard to keep them apart. If you're doing it with different channels, I think it works. But I do think you had to have separate creative fulfilling quite different tasks.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really good ending, actually, for what has been a very excellent presentation. So, Ian, thank you very much for the presentation. Tim, thank you for allowing us to use your data and for taking part in the panel today. The white paper that this is all based on is available now on both the DMA website and the Red Group website. We will send out some emails tomorrow with a link to the recording and a link to the white paper and a little survey in terms of other potential webinars we'll run and what you would be interested in from seeing those. So other than just thanking Ian and Tim again, thank you guys, really appreciated. Thanking everyone for attending and spending an hour of the day listening to us witter on. I hope you all have a great day and hopefully see you again soon. Thank you.
Cheers all. Thanks very much.